So today on the Strategy Shift podcast, we're joined by Steven Vito, a veteran media strategist and federal market expert with nearly 3 decades of experience. He's the founder of Vito Associates, co-creator of the government-focused show Government Matters, and a former executive at the VA and Government Executive Media Group. Steven brings deep insight to how strategy, storytelling, innovation shape success in both government and in business. But more importantly, Steven, Tom, you don't know this, and I kept this a secret. Steven's also from Providence, Rhode Island. And what's even more impressive than his 30-year career is that he actually uses R's.
You know, I have to tell you a funny story. So this morning I'm talking to my daughter and I'm telling her I'm going to be on this podcast. She said, "Dad, pronounce your R's." Okay, I'll keep that in mind.
Which is an awesome introduction since you're a communication expert. You know what I mean? I'd love to start out there. That's great.
Steven, I need you, before we get into it, I need you to tell Tom how do you say brother?
Well, I just, I was up in Rhode Island last weekend and I was reminded of this because it was my brother's birthday. I went up there and everyone was saying, "Oh, it's so great that your brother who was a doctor is having this birthday party."
Yeah.
And I always leave Rhode Island, and I love it up there. I love it. I always leave saying, "Wow, did I talk like that?"
Yeah. I not to get completely off subject. We watch these like singing shows and things like this. I'm always amazed at like somebody that has a really hard accent, whether they're Australian or something like that, and you listen to them sing, and it's just such a beautiful melody. You know what I mean? And then like you like listen to their like talking voice, and you're like, how did that happen? Like how did that happen? Anyway.
Well, I can't sing, so it doesn't.
All right, so we're going to get into Steven's going to pronounce his R's, but Steven, we checked out your LinkedIn posts, which was fantastic, and I would like you to talk a little bit about the omissions and the 2 errors companies make in strategic communications.
Yeah, I mean, I've been in this business a long time and always on, media and marketing communication side. And it just occurred to me that there are certain things that companies don't do, but should. And it doesn't add to the expense. It doesn't add to the stress, but they should be doing some fundamental things, and often they don't. So I wrote this talk and I presented it at a conference, and I was blown away by the response. So many people came up to me afterwards, and I think that was the genesis of really us connecting, and came up to me and said, "Yes, I can relate to that." So some of the more prominent omissions. Number one, in my mind, there's no communication strategy. They'll spend money, but they don't have a strategy. At a minimum, the strategy should include defining who are the stakeholders. And typically they'll say, "Yeah, we know who the stakeholders are. They're our clients or maybe our prospects." Well, it's beyond that. It certainly is that. But maybe there's other people that you should be thinking about. You should be thinking about tomorrow's prospects. You should be thinking about maybe partners. You should be thinking about media. So there's a lot of stakeholders that they don't often think about. They haven't defined their goals and objectives. That's important because they want to measure success, but if they haven't defined the goals and objectives, it's going to be tough. They haven't defined the messaging for the various stakeholders. They haven't defined a budget. So again, a lot of times I see this and they don't have an overall strategy. So another thing that I've noticed companies don't do, but should, is they don't project thought leadership. There is a wealth of research on this, particularly in the B2B and B2G market, where, my background is primarily B2G over these last, 30 years or so, but I was certainly in B2B. You have to project thought.
And these concepts, Stephen, are universal, right? It doesn't matter what vertical you're targeting. These are
no question about
overall issues.
No question about it. I mean, when you You can even apply it to yourself. When you go and you want to do business with somebody, you want to make sure they know what the heck they're talking about. And that's why you have to project thought leadership. And sponsored content, you see that often in a lot of websites. That is a great way of projecting thought leadership. You're not projecting necessarily, you're not promoting your product necessarily, you're promoting that you know what the heck your company is doing. And then also, there's other things that you can be doing in that. Social media has a strong role in that. Okay, 3, no database of stakeholders. Oh, yeah, we got a database. We have all these names. Well, okay, maybe you do have some names, but there's 2 elements that you often don't find in stakeholders. One, they're often not segmented. Some stakeholders are clients, some are prospects, some are different categories. You have to segment your stakeholders. 2, and this is probably even more important, you have to think about replenishing those people that will no longer be in your database. People move on, people go to different companies, people die. I mean, the fact is, my back of the envelope kind of calculation, 30% of your 30% of your database will turn over every year. So if you have 5,000 names, you got to, just to stay at 5,000, you got to get 1,500 names. So that's very important. All right, number 4. This one really blows my mind. No social media strategy. Why? I don't understand it. Social media is a godsend. You can be posting stuff, and I want to get into this a little bit. You can be posting stuff for no fee, or you can certainly pay to post things. But you can be very targeted to who your audience is, and then you can target your messaging to that specific audience. Social media, I think, has just been tremendous. Every company should have it. And by the way, it's not just posting. You want to look at who's following you. Is that who you want to follow you? If it's not, then reach out to those folks and
Right.
have
And
them
Stephen,
try
that's
to
going to
follow.
reinforce your organizational brand. And then you also talked about the importance of establishing yourself as a thought leader. And then you're going to be able to do that by implementing a formal social media strategy, positioning yourself as that.
Correct. Social media is just wonderful. I mean, I use LinkedIn a lot, but there's certainly, heavens knows, there's so many others to use, and I can't recommend that enough. Now, this next one I'm going to mention, this is most pertinent to government marketers. However, it is somewhat pertinent to B2B. I see this a lot. There is a gap between what the marketing folks are messaging and what the sales and BD folks are messaging. They have to be on the same page. They have to be saying the same things. And too often, they're not. And that is easily repaired. That gap can easily be minimized. How? Once a quarter, once every 6 months. Have a meeting with the head of BD and sales, with the head of marketing, have a cup of coffee and just go over these fundamental things on what you're going to be messaging over the next quarter, or maybe once every 6 months. I had this situation with a client, and again, what messaging coming from marketing and what coming from the sales and BD were totally different. We just would just get into a room and talk it through, and next thing you know, they're on the same page. How simple is that? Okay, so those are the 5 what I call prominent omissions. When I first put that presentation together, I was asked to do something on best practices in marketing, strategic communications. I felt, yeah, okay, I could do that, but that's a yawn. I think half the audience will be sleeping by the time I got through it. So next, I thought, well, maybe I'll talk about mistakes that companies make. Then I said, that's sort of arrogant. One person's mistake is another person's, benefit. So who am I to say what's right and what's wrong? So that's when I went to omissions. Just glaring things that I've seen companies don't do, but should. Those were those 5. But
Yeah.
having said all that,
Yeah, no, and this is great. And the thing that I really like about this is that all five of the things that you suggested have two choices, and that is it can be DIY'd or it could be paid for a professional to do it for you or guide it through you. Like you
absolutely.
have those choices. It's not like you're asking something that is impossible to do on your own. These are omissions of like literally just utter neglect.
You know, Tom, you're bringing up a really good point because too often I hear companies say, "Oh, we don't do much communications." That drives me wild when I hear that, by the way. We don't do much communications because it's so expensive. Baloney.
Yeah.
That's baloney. You could have a communication campaign that is on social media, that is primarily email based, um, that you can do blogs, newsletters. We're talking about a minimal amount of money. It can probably even be done in house. I would certainly recommend going outside to have it professionally done.
Mm.
But if budget is an issue, some of these things can be done in house. So
The
good
bottom
point.
line is it can be implemented, whether you're doing it internally or you're hiring people to do it, it needs to be get done, period.
Yeah.
I mean, I think one of the reasons a lot of companies don't communicate is because they they have this sense that one, as I said, it's expensive, but two, this is one of the excuses I've heard. Oh, we know who the decision makers are. We'll just reach out to them. I don't need a
Mm.
marketing campaign. Well, that's baloney, because there are hidden influences in every single decision, even in our own lives. There are hidden influences that we rely on to make decisions, and and your sales team may not know exactly who those hidden influences. By definition, they're hidden. And that's what marketing communications. So I really think one of the reasons is that strategic communications too often is not done is because a lot of leadership in some companies, not all, some companies don't understand it. They don't understand strategic communications.
Well,
Yeah.
Tom, talk about that for a second. Like from the mentality of an owner, they think, oh, I know who the decision maker is, but I'm not paying attention to the outside external influencers, the champion, the person who's doing the technical evaluation. Talk about that as far as the importance of identifying all the people in the sales process.
I, you know, if one of the great, I think one of the great bodies of knowledge that are not drawn on enough is the sales team.
Mhm.
If the senior leadership just sat down with the sales folks and said, all right, let's talk about your interaction with company XYZ. And you'll hear, them say, yeah, I could not get to their colleague, or I could not get to the finance person that has the budget. I mean,
Mm.
these are things that, when done right, strategic communications can approach. And as I said, there is a body of research on this. In my article, there was two pieces of research I really liked. One was by Edelman. You could Google it. It's on thought leadership marketing and the importance of it. Um, and that talks about how to get to those hidden influences and how to message to them. There's another piece that they just did. It was in June, just last month, on the importance of, again, thought leadership, and it's all based on marketing. It's in on LinkedIn. They have a B2B marketing blog that I love, and I highly recommend people subscribe to it. But in their most recent one in June, it talked about, and again, based on research, it talked about that the higher up in an organization, the less typical advertising has an impact, but the more sponsored content, thought leadership pieces have an impact.
I want to bring up a point real fast that you and I were talking about because I really want this to lay hard on our audience, right? And one thing that stuck with me from the conversation that we had is just the basic quote of if you fail to communicate, you fail. right? And that goes for internal conversations that you're having inside your own team, to external conversations in all different ice cream flavors that you can come up with. But ultimately, what it comes down to is, right, that if you neglect the power of communication, you're either going to struggle like intensely or you're going to straight up fail, right? So let's talk about a little bit of that, Steve. And I love the fact that you're doing five omissions because we want to leave our guests with going, communications is very important. And let's leave today on not having to solve it or change the world, but take the steps in the right direction to get better, right?
You know,
Help me
Tommy,
understand.
you're bringing up a great point, and that line comes from my former boss at Veterans Affairs. I was in communications at Veterans Affairs, VA, and he had a line that I love, and that is, if you fail to communicate, you fail. His name is Reggie Humphreys. Reggie, if you're listening, I give you proper credit, bro. But if you fail to communicate, you fail. That's not only true in our personal lives, but it's certainly true in the business life. Here's what I think is an issue. Too often, executives confuse marketing with strategic communications. Yes, marketing is definitely part of strategic communications, no part of it. But strategic communications is a couple of levels higher than marketing. It includes, as I said, it includes just maybe doing blogs, doing thought leadership pieces. You're not selling anything. I mean, think of this. Companies have employees working hard. They develop a good product or they deliver a good service, and then they don't communicate. What is the logic in that? You need to communicate continually. And you have to think through who are all the stakeholders. In the government market, stakeholders also include the Hill. That's very important, obviously, to say the least, a stakeholder. But you have internal stakeholders and you have external stakeholders. And you have to define the messaging that's relative to each of those stakeholders.
And I love the fact that like, look, problem solving, right? Like we all, that's what we get paid for a living. Just you fill in the blank for what you do as a problem solver. But the funniest part, and I think that like, since you live in this world, it's got to bring some type of level of humor, is that like every problem that we're originally trying to solve, right? Often comes down to like this soundbite, like, right? Like what we have here is a failure to communicate. Like in general,
Yes.
that's what it is. And then you go like,
Yes.
how do we fix the communication, whether it's internal, external, or something like that? And once the communication is fixed, of course, there's tactical issues that go in with it. But the main core issue, right, Steve, is there is a breakdown of communication. There's a breakdown, right?
Yeah, and too often it's not, as I said, I've seen it. It's just not done. I think again, it's because a lot of executives confuse it with marketing. In fact, when I gave that presentation at the conference recently, I replaced the word marketing with communications because again, I feel communications is a couple of levels higher than marketing, and it encompasses a lot more than just doing the selling pitch.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's just fundamental. You know, it's funny. If you go to some of these senior level executives, they'll have a good understanding of finance. They'll have a good understanding of HR. Often they won't have a good understanding of communications.
Mm.
Yeah, and Stephen, we'll talk about expand on that. And specifically, you talked about how companies try to measure communications performance against revenue and why that's a mistake.
That is a, you know, I'm glad you mentioned that, Adam, because there are, and I talked about in this talk that I gave, there are some mistakes that just have to be discussed. And one of the mistakes I measured is one of the mistakes I made is the measurement of communications. Too often they want to measure it against revenue. That is crazy. Why? Because there are a lot of factors on why a client pulled the trigger and bought your particular product or service. Um, there are a lot of things influencing that decision. Communications is just one. However, you can measure communications, perhaps, if this is what is in the, again, in the strategy, You can measure it against what your goals and objectives are. Maybe your goals and objectives is to grow your pipeline. Maybe your goals and objectives is to grow your pipeline with a particular type of person or a particular type of company. Maybe that's what you should be measuring your communications against. Also, you could measure it against your social media following. If you have X number of social media followers and you want to grow that to Y, or you want to grow it to a particular demographic of follower, that's something you can measure against. If you have a newsletter or a blog, you can measure your marketing communications against the number of subscribers you have to that. Or even better is the number of people who don't subscribe, who unsubscribe. You want to obviously minimize that. And another thing that often overlooked, and again, I was in the media business for 150 years. One of the things overlooked is media in your particular market segment should be considered a stakeholder, particularly a specific editor or reporter. Have they contacted you about maybe, giving a comment on a story or talking at one of their conferences? So media should be part of it. Those are ways to measure your communications, not just against revenue. Revenue has so many components to it. To put it all on communications will only give you a misleading evaluation of communications.
Steve, I want to go into a quantity question, and that is this. When I ever talk to somebody, I know that they're struggling with their communications when they have to say too much. Right. And so like being choosy, and I love the example, right, of like play I apologize for writing this long email. I didn't have enough time to write a short one, right? Like
Mark
I
Twain,
love
right?
that example. You know what I mean? But like communications is one of these issues where it's like start out by just rambling on about everything. But if you want to be strategic, right, the goal is to cut out noise and speak in a clear, concise, and compelling way. Can you like
Yes.
enlighten us a little bit about that
Yes,
whole
Tom, I'm
idea?
telling you, you're bringing up just a fundamental point. Um, and again, by the way, it speaks to the strategy, the development of the strategy. So when you're doing your messaging, you shouldn't assume one message is applicable to everybody. It's not, to all your various stakeholders. In fact, I'm a big believer in micro messaging. That is to say, have a message specific to that segment in your stakeholder database. Um, and by the way, don't think of it as a one-time shot. I am going to tell this stakeholder everything that they want to know. Well, guess what? They're not going to read it, or they're just not. So you have to think in terms of a cadence, I like to think in terms of 12 months. This month, we're going to talk about this. Next month, it's this. Third month, it's this. Have a stream of messaging, because if you put too much on the table, it defeats the purpose. No one's going to digest it.
I love that.
Outstanding. All right, so Tom, we got time for one more question.
Uh-oh.
We'll get a little pressure on you to come up with one killer question, and then Stephen, you're going to have to tell us how our audience can reach you.
Awesome.
More
Well,
specifically, how
here's
can they communicate with you?
Yeah, here's my question, Steve, and it's said in slightly different ways each time, but still the same thing. If you've got a minute to feed our target audience one thing that you want to leave with them to improve their communications today, what would that be?
Oh, that's easy. Develop a strategy. Really, develop a strategy. And again, do your homework on what is entailed in a strategy. It's the who, what, when, where, how. That really is. Who are the stakeholders? How are you going to communicate? What's the means of delivery? What's the messaging? How are you going to measure your goals and objectives? Just have a strategy. That has to be, I think, the number one omission, and it wasn't my number one omission that I've seen. Companies just don't think that through.
So I think what I'm gathering from me is two different quotes for our target audience, and that is if you fail to communicate, you fail. And then adding on to that is if you don't plan right? Plan to fail. The mesh of those two quotes right there is pretty much what we want all of our small business folks in this community to walk away with. Steve, we sincerely appreciate you bringing your expertise on today. We loved having you. If anybody is interested in contacting you specifically for strategic communications discussions, how do we get in touch with you?
Very, very simple. Send me an email. My email address is svito, S-V-I-T-O, at vitoandassociates.com. And I do read all my emails, and I try my best to respond to each one.
Well,
This has
that's
been fantastic. I want to thank you, brother.
Thank you. Your brother, he's a doctor, right? Isn't he a doctor? Guys, thank you so much. You do a great job. I'm honored to be part of this.
Thank you again.
Steve, thanks for jumping on. Really appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
Yeah.
Bye.